Why would a man pull a dying woman into his bed, only to discover he could never let her go? If you find this story as captivating as I do, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more tales of love and survival. The cold was a living thing in this high country. It seeped through the thickest wool, settled deep in a man's bones, and held the land in a grip of iron and ice for half the year. Silas knew its nature as well as he knew his own. He was a man carved from the same hard material as the mountains that surrounded him. His cabin, a single stout room of hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, stood as a solitary monument to endurance against the relentless wind. He had built it himself, sinking its foundations deep into the stony soil, its single window facing east to catch the first spare light of dawn. The lines at the corners of his eyes came from years of squinting into that wind, scanning the vast, empty horizons. They were not lines of laughter. Laughter was a foreign currency here, a coin he had not held in a very long time. His life was a silent rhythm of necessity, chopping wood, checking his trap lines, cleaning his rifle, and watching. Always watching. The world had taught him that the greatest threats did not announce themselves with a roar, but with a whisper on the wind, a shadow moving where no shadow should be. He had lost everything to such a whisper once before, and the silence that followed had become his only companion. He did not seek to change this. Solitude was a fortress, its walls built of routine and vigilance. Inside, there was no room for hope, but there was also no purchase for despair. There was only the steady, metronomic beat of survival, one day bleeding into the next. A blizzard was coming. He could smell it in the air, a sharp, metallic tongue that spoke of heavy snow. He could see it in the behavior of the animals. The squirrels were frantic, and the deer had already moved to the thicker, lower groves. He spent the day securing his world against the coming onslaught. He brought in enough firewood to last a week, stacking it neatly against the interior wall. He checked the leather latch on the heavy plank door and reinforced the shutter on the small window. He drew fresh water from the well, the bucket already crusting with ice by the time he got it inside. As the first flakes began to drift down from a sky the color of slate, he stood on his small porch, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The world was shrinking, the distant peaks disappearing behind a curtain of white. This was a familiar state of being, the world outside erased, his existence narrowed to the four walls of his cabin, the fire in his hearth, and the steady beat of his own heart. He felt no fear, only a grim acceptance. The storm was not an enemy. It was simply a condition of the world he inhabited, and he was prepared for it. He turned to go inside when a flicker of movement at the edge of the tree line caught his eye. It was unnatural, a darker shape against the deepening gray, struggling and falling against the tide of the wind. It was not an animal. An animal would have better sense than to be caught out in this. He stood motionless for a long moment, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. His first instinct, honed by years of isolation, was to retreat, to bar the door and let the storm claim whatever fool had wandered into its path. It was not his concern. But his feet remained planted, his eyes fixed on the shape. It fell again and did not rise. The protector in him, the man he had been before the silence, stirred from its long slumber. With a curse that was lost to the wind, he pulled his collar tight and strode out into the burgeoning storm. He found her half buried in a drift, a small, dark bundle of wet wool and colder flesh. He knelt, his gloved hand turning her face to the meager light. It was a woman. Her skin was pale as milk, lips a faint, bruised blue. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes and hair. When he pressed his fingers to her neck, the pulse he found was a faint, frantic flutter, a trapped bird beating its wings against the cage of her ribs. There was no thought, only a grim, mechanical purpose. He lifted her into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. The wind tore at them, trying to rip her from his grasp, but he set his jaw, lowered his head, and pushed through the blinding snow, following a path only he could see back to the cabin. Inside, the warmth of the fire was a shock. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the hearth, her body limp and unresponsive. Her clothes were soaked through, plastered to her skin with a layer of melting snow and ice. Leaving them on would be a death sentence. He worked with a detached efficiency, his calloused fingers struggling with the frozen laces of her bodice and the sodden weight of her skirts. He did not look at her as a man looks at a woman. He looked at her as a farrier looks at a lame horse, a problem to be solved with practical, unsentimental action. He stripped away the wet layers until she was clad only in a thin, torn chemise, her skin frighteningly cold to the touch. He piled every blanket he owned on top of her, but he knew it wasn't enough. The cold was inside her, a deep, killing chill that external warmth alone could not banish. He looked from her shivering form to the single bed built into the far wall his bed. There was only one way. He banked the fire high, then stripped to his own dry underclothes. He lifted her, a fragile weight wrapped in a cocoon of wool, and carried her to the bed. He laid her down and then slid in beside her, pulling the heavy furs over them both. He drew her shivering body against his own, her back to his chest, wrapping his arms around her. It was a clinical act, a transfer of heat from his body to hers. But as he lay there in the dark, the storm howling outside and the faint, desperate rhythm of her breathing in his ear, the silence of his fortress was broken. He had brought the world inside, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deeper than the cold, that nothing would ever be the same. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and brewing herbs. Her first sensation was a deep, aching warmth that seemed to have soaked all the way to her bones. Her second was confusion. She was in a bed, wrapped in heavy furs, in a small, rough-hewn room she did not recognize. A fire crackled in a stone hearth nearby. Her third sensation was a jolt of pure, cold fear. A man sat on a stool in the corner, his back to her, sharpening a large knife with slow, methodical strokes of a whetstone. He was broad-shouldered and still, a silhouette against the firelight. Panic seized her. She tried to sit up, a strangled cry catching in her throat, but a wave of dizziness and weakness pushed her back down. The movement, slight as it was, caught his attention. He stopped sharpening the knife and turned his head slowly. In the dim light, she could see a weathered face, a thick beard, and eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. They held no malice, no avarice, but a flat, watchful calm that was somehow more unnerving. He stood, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought he was coming for her. Instead, he walked to the hearth, ladled a steaming liquid from a small pot into a wooden cup, and placed it on the floor beside the bed, a careful distance from her hand. He did not speak. He simply backed away and returned to his stool, picking up his knife and stone, as if she were no more than a stray cat he had allowed to shelter from the storm. Elara stared at the cup. She was desperately thirsty, her throat raw. But her mind raced, replaying fragmented memories, the biting wind, the snow, the feeling of falling into an endless white void. She remembered the men, the shouting, the terror that had driven her into the teeth of the blizzard in the first place. She pushed herself up on one elbow, her body trembling with effort and fear. Her wet clothes were draped over a line near the fire, steaming gently. She was wearing only her thin chemise. The realization sent another wave of dread through her. She looked from her drying clothes to the man, then to the heavy furs that covered her. He had undressed her. He had put her in his bed. Her hand instinctively went to the hilt of the small dagger she kept hidden, but it was gone. He saw the movement, his eyes flicking to her empty belt, and then back to her face. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod towards the mantel above the fireplace. Her dagger was there, cleaned and placed carefully next to a tin of rifle cartridges. He had disarmed her, but he had not taken her weapon. It was a gesture she could not immediately decipher. He went back to his work, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel filling the small cabin. It was the only sound besides the wind and the fire. The silence stretched, thick with her fear and his impenetrable calm. Slowly, cautiously, she reached for the cup. The herbal broth was hot and savory. It spread warmth through her chest, quelling the shivers. He had saved her. He had also undressed her and put her in his bed. He now sat in the corner, armed while she was weak and vulnerable. The two truths warred within her, leaving her coiled with a suspicion as deep as the snow outside. The blizzard raged for 3 days. The world beyond the cabin's single window was a swirling vortex of white, erasing the landscape and sealing them inside. For 3 days, Silas and the woman, Elara, he learned her name when she whispered it in a feverish. Sleep existed in a state of suspended silence. The small room became their entire universe, governed by unspoken rules and cautious observation. He slept on the hard-packed earth floor near the hearth, rolled in a spare horse blanket, ceding the bed to her entirely. He never approached her without a clear, functional purpose: to add a log to the fire, to offer her food, or to change the damp cloth on her forehead when the fever was at its worst. His movements were deliberate, economical, and he kept a careful distance, granting her a perimeter of space that was hers alone. Elara watched him from the bed, her initial terror slowly giving way to a wary curiosity. She saw the way he moved, with a quiet competence that spoke of a life of hardship and self-reliance. He wasted no motion, no word. When he prepared food, a simple stew of dried meat and roots, he divided it into 2 equal portions. When he cleaned his rifle, his hands moved with a familiar, practiced grace that was both reassuring and intimidating. He was a dangerous man. She had no doubt of that. But his danger did not seem to be directed at her. On the 2nd day, her fever broke. She woke feeling weak, but clear-headed for the first time. She sat up, the furs pooling around her waist. He was at his small workbench, mending a leather strap, the muscles in his back and shoulders shifting under his worn shirt. He seemed to feel her gaze, for he stopped his work and looked over at her. His eyes, which she now saw were a pale, clouded gray like a winter sky, held their usual unreadable expression. She found her voice, a dry, raspy thing. "Thank you," she said. It was the first word she had spoken to him. He held her gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, curt nod. He turned back to his work, and the silence resumed, but it had changed. A single thread of connection had been woven into it. Later that day, she felt strong enough to leave the bed. She swung her legs over the side, her feet touching the cold floor. Her clothes, now dry, were folded neatly on a stool. She dressed slowly, her body still weak and aching. He did not watch her, affording her the privacy of his turned back. When she was dressed, she walked to the hearth, drawn by the warmth. She saw her torn cloak, hanging from a peg. He had stitched the long, ragged tear in it with neat, strong stitches, the thread darker than the original fabric, a visible scar of repair. The sight of it moved her more than any words could have. It was an act of quiet, practical care, giving without expectation of thanks. He had mended that which was broken. She picked up a spare blanket, the one he had been using, and folded it. Then she took the bowl from her last meal, carried it to the wash basin, and cleaned it. They were small gestures, but in the silence of the cabin, they were a conversation. They were the first lines of a treaty being drawn between 2 survivors. On the morning of the 4th day, the world was born anew. The wind had died, and the sun rose into a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. It struck the fresh snow, making the landscape glitter with a light so bright it was hard to look at. Silas opened the door, and the clean, cold air flooded the cabin. The silence of the world outside was absolute, a profound stillness that seemed to press in on them. He stepped out onto the porch, his eyes immediately beginning their ceaseless scan of the horizon, a habit as ingrained as breathing. The snow was deep, a pristine blanket that covered everything, softening the hard edges of the land. But it was not pristine. Near the tree line, where he had found her, the snow was disturbed. And leading away from that spot, partially filled but still visible, was another set of tracks. Not hers, the tracks of two horses, heading back the way she had come. They had been searching for her. They had been close. A cold knot formed in his gut. His solitude had been breached not just by the woman, but by the threat that followed her. He went back inside, his face grim. Elara was by the fire, her expression questioning as she saw his. He did not speak. He went to the wall where his rifle rested on two wooden pegs. He took it down, checked the action, and then took the tin of cartridges from the mantel. He looked at her then, a long, direct gaze. "They will be back," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to her. She did not ask who they were. The fear that flared in her eyes told him she knew perfectly well. She straightened her shoulders, a flicker of the same resilience he had first sensed in her returning to her face. He walked to the heavy plank door and examined the bar he had fashioned for it, a thick length of solid oak. He tested its strength. Then he went to the window, inspecting the wooden shutter and its leather hinge. He was fortifying his home. He was preparing for a fight. He looked around the small cabin, his fortress, and saw it now through new eyes. It had been a shelter for one. Now it had to be a bastion for two. His gaze fell on her dagger, still lying on the mantel. He picked it up and walked over to her. He held it out, hilt first. "You know how to use this," he stated. It wasn't a question. Elara looked from the knife to his face. His expression was unreadable, but his gesture was not. He was not just returning her weapon. He was arming an ally. She took the knife, her fingers closing around the familiar worn leather of the hilt. The weight of it was a small comfort. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He gave another of his curt nods and turned away, his mind already working, calculating angles, defenses, and the grim arithmetic of violence. The quiet treaty of survival had ended. A new pact, one of shared defense, had just been sealed. The days that followed were filled with a tense, focused energy. The silent understanding that had grown between them in the stillness of the blizzard now sharpened into a practical partnership. Silas did not explain his reasoning. He demonstrated it. He brought in his second rifle, a slightly older but well cared for model, from a hidden oilcloth wrap in the small loft. He laid it on the table and began to clean it. Elara watched him, her hands clasped together. When he was done, he pushed the rifle and a small pouch of ammunition across the table to her. Her eyes widened slightly. He simply tapped the loading gate. "Watch," he said. And then, with slow, precise movements, he walked her through the process of loading and clearing the weapon. He didn't ask if she had ever fired a gun. He assumed she had not. He showed her how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. She was a quick study. Her hands, he noticed, were steady and sure. She learned the mechanics of the rifle with a quiet intensity, her brow furrowed in concentration. Her presence was no longer just a complication. It was becoming a strategic asset. Together, they made the cabin ready. It was a slow, deliberate process, a silent conversation spoken in the language of action. He stacked firewood inside the door, creating a low barricade. She, seeing his intent, found a place for everything so that the floor remained clear, with unobstructed lines of sight from the window to the door. He showed her how to bar the door from the inside, and she found a way to wedge a small block of wood into the shutter's latch, making it more secure. They worked in tandem, moving around each other in the confined space with an instinctive grace. There were no wasted movements, no apologies for bumping into one another. It was a dance of pure function. The symbolism of their labor was not lost on either of them, though they would never have spoken of it. They were building a fortress together. Each log stacked, each latch secured, was another stone in the wall they were erecting against the world outside. The shared meals continued, but now they were eaten with rifles leaning against the table beside them. The quiet was no longer one of peaceful observation. It was the tense, watchful silence of sentries on duty. In the evenings, he would sit by the window, staring out at the stark, moonlit snow, his own rifle across his lap. She would take the first watch, her posture alert, the second rifle held ready. They trusted each other enough to sleep. One evening, as he oiled the lock on his rifle, she spoke, her voice soft in the firelight. "My father taught me to shoot a bow," she said, an unexpected offering of her past. But he said a rifle was no weapon for a girl. Silas stopped his work and looked at her. "Your father was wrong," he said, his tone flat and declarative. "It's a weapon for a survivor." He went back to his work, but the space between them had shrunk a little more. She was no longer just a woman he was protecting. She was a soldier standing the line with him. And in the harsh calculus of his world, there was no deeper trust than that. The men appeared at the edge of the clearing 2 days later, just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the snow in shades of orange and blood. There were 3 of them, dark figures on horseback against the brilliant backdrop. They did not approach the cabin directly, but fanned out, circling it like wolves sizing up their prey. Silas had seen them coming. He had been on the porch, splitting the last of the day's logs, when the faint sound of shod hooves on packed snow reached him. He had simply laid down his axe, gone inside, and barred the door. Elara was already at the window, the second rifle in her hands. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. One of the riders, a large man with a thick, dark beard and a crueler cut to his face than the winter wind, trotted his horse forward. He stopped 100 feet from the cabin, well out of pistol range, but close enough for his voice to carry on the still, cold air. "Silas, I know you're in there, you old ghost. We tracked the girl to your land. Send her out." The man's voice was full of a coarse, bullying arrogance. Silas remained at the side of the window, a shadow in the dim interior, his own rifle resting on the sill. He did not answer. He watched the man, whose name he now guessed was Thorn, and assessed the other 2. They were younger, fidgety, their eyes darting around nervously. They were followers, not leaders. The danger was Thorn. "She's my property," Thorn shouted, his voice rising in frustration at the cabin's silence. "Stole a horse and ran off. There's a bounty on her, but I'll settle for just getting her back. Don't make this your business, old man." Elara flinched at the word property, a flicker of pain and anger crossing her face. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the rifle stock. Silas saw it. He didn't look at her, but he spoke, his voice low and calm, meant only for her. "Steady." The word was a simple command, but it was also an anchor. Her breathing evened out. Outside, Thorn was growing impatient. He spat on the snow. "Fine. Have it your way. We'll wait you out. You've got to sleep sometime. And when you do, we're coming in. We'll burn you out if we have to." He backed his horse away, rejoining his men. They dismounted at the edge of the woods, built a small, smoky fire, and settled in for a siege. They thought time was on their side. Silas knew otherwise. In this cold, time was a weapon, and it belonged to the one who was prepared. The sun dipped below the peaks, and the world was plunged into a deep purple twilight. The fire from the men's camp was a defiant orange eye in the growing darkness. Inside the cabin, Silas and Elara remained at their posts, 2 silent figures in the gloom. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. He knew she was frightened. He could feel it radiating from her, a fine tremor in the stillness. But she did not falter. She did not make a sound. She just stood her ground, the rifle held at the ready, her gaze fixed on the enemy. In that moment, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a grudging, hard-won respect. She was not just a survivor. She was a fighter, and she was standing beside him. Night fell like a shroud. The temperature plummeted, and the moon rose, casting long skeletal shadows across the snow. The fire from the besiegers' camp was the only point of warmth and color in the vast, monochrome landscape. Inside the cabin it was dark, save for the faint red glow from the banked embers in the hearth. To light a lamp would be to make themselves a target. Silas and Elara remained at their posts, he at the window, she near the door. The silence stretched, hour after hour, broken only by the occasional crackle of the embers or the distant stamp of a horse. They were waiting. They knew an attack would not come while the moon was high. It would come in the deep, starless dark before the dawn, when men's spirits were at their lowest ebb and sleep was at its most profound. Around midnight, Silas moved from the window. He touched Elara's shoulder lightly. She started at the contact, but didn't make a sound. "Rest," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "I will watch." She hesitated, shaking her head. "I can stay." "One of us must be fresh," he said, his logic irrefutable. "An hour. Then you wake me." She finally acquiesced, her shoulders slumping slightly with exhaustion. She didn't go to the bed. Instead, she sat on the floor, her back against the wall, the rifle across her lap. It was not the sleep of the safe, but the fitful, alert rest of a soldier. Silas returned to the window. The cold from the glass seeped into the wood of the sill. He watched the fire, the way the two younger men huddled close to it, while Thorn, the leader, stood apart, a restless, pacing shadow. He was overconfident. He saw an old man and a woman, a soft target. He didn't see the years of discipline etched into the cabin's defender. He didn't understand the desperate resolve of the woman he was hunting. An hour passed, then another. Silas did not wake her. He let her sleep, a small, selfish act of protection. He felt the familiar weight of the vigil settle over him. It was a weight he had carried many times before. But this time, it was different. He was not just defending a piece of land, a shelter. He was defending the life within it. A life that had, against all his intentions, become entangled with his own. The attack came, as he knew it would, in the blackest hour of the night. It began not with a shout, but with a sudden, dull thud against the door. Elara was awake instantly, moving from a resting position to a defensive crouch in a single fluid motion. Another thud, heavier this time. They were using a log as a battering ram. "The window," Silas said, his voice cutting through the dark. "The one on the right." He moved to the door, pressing his shoulder against the thick planks, adding his weight to the heavy bar. Elara was already at the window, peering through a small crack in the shutter. The heavy rifle barrel slid through the opening, silent and deadly. The thudding stopped. There was a moment of tense silence, then a man's voice, whispering orders. The wood of the door groaned, the bar straining. "Now," Silas said, his voice flat. A deafening roar filled the cabin as Elara fired. A strangled cry from outside, followed by a heavy fall. The assault on the door ceased immediately. They had not expected armed resistance, certainly not from that direction. A furious shout from Thorn cut through the night, a string of curses. Then the sound of scrambling, of men retreating to the cover of the trees. The first wave was over, but they both knew it was only the beginning. The brief lull was a reprieve, not a victory. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, a sharp, acrid scent that mingled with the cold. Silas remained braced against the door, listening. Elara reloaded the rifle with swift, practiced movements, her face illuminated in the brief flash of the first shot, a mask of grim determination. "They'll come again," she said, her voice low and steady. From two sides, Silas nodded in the darkness. "The door is my concern. You watch the window." He didn't need to say more. The plan was simple, brutal, and their only option. They were no longer two people. They were a single defensive unit, each anticipating the other's needs. The second assault was more cunning. A volley of shots peppered the front of the cabin, the heavy slugs thudding into the thick logs. It was covering fire. Under the noise, Silas heard a scraping sound at the base of the shuttered window. They were trying to pry it open. At the same moment, the battering ram hit the door again, harder this time, with the weight of two men behind it. The wood shuddered, and the bar groaned in protest. "Window," Silas grunted, his feet sliding on the floor as he threw his full weight against the door. He heard Elara move, heard the soft click as she cocked the rifle. Another thunderous crack echoed in the small room, this time aimed low through the shutter. A scream of pain from directly below the window told her she had found her mark. But the door was failing. A hinge splintered, and the top of the door buckled inward, creating a gap. A hand and an arm reached through, fumbling for the bar. Silas didn't hesitate. He brought the butt of his rifle down on the arm with savage force. There was a sickening crunch of bone and a howl of agony as the arm was withdrawn. But the damage was done. The door was compromised. Thorn roared in frustration and fury from the darkness. "All of you now. Bring it down." The full weight of the men hit the door at once. With a final, ear-splitting crack of splintering wood, the bar snapped. The door flew inward, and the night rushed in. The first man through was a silhouette against the snow, a pistol in his hand. Silas met him with the force of a grizzly, not firing his rifle, but using it as a club, a brutal, efficient swing that sent the man crashing backward into the one behind him. The fight descended into chaos, a desperate, close-quarters struggle in the dark. It was all grunts, the thud of fists, the shriek of tearing fabric, and the frantic gasps of men fighting for their lives. Silas was a whirlwind of controlled violence. Years of solitude had not dulled the instincts of a man who had known war. He moved with a brutal economy, striking to disable, to end the threat as quickly as possible. He felled a second man with a sweeping blow to the legs and a sharp jab to the throat. But he was outnumbered. As he grappled with one attacker, Thorn finally burst through the doorway, a massive looming figure with a wild look in his eyes. He ignored Silas, his gaze locking on Elara across the room. "You!" he bellowed, a word full of possessive rage. He started for her, shoving the other man aside. Elara raised her rifle, but Thorn was too close, too fast. He lunged, grabbing the barrel and ripping it from her hands. She stumbled back, her hand flying to the dagger at her belt. Silas saw it happen. He threw his opponent off him and turned to intercept Thorn, but the third man, recovering, tackled him from the side. They crashed to the floor, rolling in a desperate struggle. Silas felt a searing pain in his side as the man's knife slid past his ribs, a shallow but debilitating wound. He roared, a sound of pure fury, and overpowered the man, his hands finding his throat. But it was too late. Thorn had Elara backed against the far wall, his large hand fisted in her hair, pulling her head back. "You are coming with me," he snarled, his face inches from hers. "You're going to learn what happens to things that run." Elara didn't scream. Her face was a mask of cold fury. With a sudden, desperate surge of strength, she brought her knee up hard into Thorn's groin. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away, the dagger he had returned to her now in her hand. She didn't slash wildly. She lunged forward, putting her whole body behind the thrust, driving the blade deep into his thigh, severing the artery. Thorn screamed, a high, unearthly sound of shock and agony. He staggered back, clutching his leg, his eyes wide with disbelief. He looked down at the blood pumping out between his fingers, a dark, pulsing torrent against the floorboards. He took one more step, then another, before his legs gave out and he collapsed, his fall shaking the small cabin. He hit the floor and did not move again. The silence that descended was sudden and absolute. It was broken only by the ragged sound of two people breathing, the whisper of the wind through the broken door, and the soft, steady drip of blood onto the floor. The immediate aftermath was a tableau of violence frozen in time. The bodies of the fallen men were dark shapes on the floor. The broken door hung askew on one hinge, letting in the cold night air and the pale pre-dawn light. Silas pushed himself to his feet, his hand pressed against the bleeding wound in his side. Pain, sharp and hot, radiated through his torso, but he ignored it. His gaze was fixed on Elara. She stood over Thorne's body, the bloody dagger still clutched in her hand. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the savage rush of adrenaline and the shock of what she had done. Her eyes were wide, her chest heaving. He took a step towards her, and she flinched, her gaze snapping up to meet his, the wild, cornered look still in her eyes. He stopped. He held up his empty hands slowly, a gesture of peace. "It's over," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You're safe." The words seemed to break the spell. The tension drained out of her, her shoulders slumping. The dagger slipped from her numb fingers and clattered to the floor. She looked at him then, truly looked at him, and saw the dark stain spreading across his shirt, the grim line of pain around his mouth. Her eyes widened in alarm. Without a word, she moved to him. Her touch, when it came, was hesitant at first, and firm and sure as she pulled his shirt away to examine the wound. The barrier of personal space that they had so carefully maintained for days was gone, erased by the intimacy of shared violence. "Sit," she commanded, her voice regaining its strength. He obeyed, sinking onto a stool, a wave of dizziness washing over him now that the fight was done. She moved with a purpose he recognized, the same no-nonsense efficiency he possessed. She tore a strip from a clean sheet, grabbed a bottle of whiskey he kept for medicinal purposes, and began to clean the wound. Her hands were gentle but unflinching. He watched her face in the growing light, her brow furrowed in concentration. The fierce survivor, the desperate fighter, was now a healer. They didn't speak. There were no words for what had passed between them. Words were inadequate for the terror, the desperation, and the brutal, terrifying necessity of their actions. The only language that made sense was the quiet, methodical work of mending. As she tied the bandage tight around his ribs, her fingers brushed against his skin. It was a simple, functional contact, but it sent a jolt through him that had nothing to do with pain. In the wreckage of his fortress, in the silence after the storm of battle, a new and unfamiliar feeling was taking root. A profound, unspoken gratitude. He was not alone. The sun rose, flooding the cabin with a clean, cold light that exposed the full horror of the night's work. The task before them was grim and unavoidable. Silas, moving stiffly, his side a constant, throbbing ache, began the work of clearing the aftermath. Elara was right beside him. They dragged the bodies out of the cabin and into the snow, their movements synchronized, a somber, silent rhythm. They worked together to haul the broken door back into place, propping it shut with a heavy chest. The repair would have to wait. There was no discussion, no assignment of tasks. He gathered the attackers' weapons. She collected their horses, which stood shivering and untethered at the edge of the woods. The work was a penance and a purification. With each grim task completed, they were washing away the violence, reclaiming their space. The cabin had been breached, violated, but they would make it whole again. They would make it theirs. By midday, the clearing was empty again. The snow churned and stained where they had worked. The only evidence of the battle was the broken door and the lingering scent of blood and fear, which the cold air was already beginning to scour away. They sat at the table, exhausted, the silence between them no longer tense or wary, but heavy with the shared weight of what they had endured. The cabin, which for years had been Silas's refuge from the world, a fortress of solitude, now felt different. It was smaller, but also less empty. It was a place that had been defended, a place that had been held against an onslaught. It was a sanctuary they had forged together in blood and desperation. He looked at her across the table. The ordeal had left its mark on her face, but it hadn't broken her. If anything, she seemed stronger, her gaze more direct, her pride a solid, unshakable thing. "Where will you go?" he asked, the question feeling hollow even as he said it. He was merely speaking the words that convention demanded. She looked around the small, battered room. Her gaze lingered on the hearth, the neatly stacked wood, the mended cloak hanging on its peg. She looked at the makeshift repair on the door, a temporary fix they had built together. Her eyes finally came to rest on his face. "I have no destination," she said softly. "I was not running to somewhere. I was only running from." The implication hung in the air between them. From him, from the men who saw her as property, her running was done. This place, this man, had been the end of the line. She had made her stand here. Silas held her gaze for a long time. The wind whistled through the cracks in the broken door. He thought of the long, silent years, the empty space at his table, the cold side of his bed. He had thought that was his life, the penance he would pay forever. But now, another path was visible. It was not an easy path, but it was not a lonely one. He gave a single, slow nod. It was all the answer she needed. The agreement was made. A new foundation was laid, not on the stony ground outside, but right here, in the quiet shared space of a room that had become a home. The seasons turned. The deep snows of winter slowly receded, giving way to the muddy thaw of spring. The world returned to life, and so did the small homestead. The scar on Silas's side faded to a pale white line, a permanent reminder of the night their world changed. The broken door was replaced with a new one, built of thicker, stronger planks, with a new iron latch he forged himself. Elara was there to help him set it in its frame, her hands sure and steady as they worked together to hang it. The act was symbolic. They were not just repairing a door, they were building a new threshold, one they would cross together. Life settled into a new rhythm, one of shared labor and quiet companionship. The silence that had once defined Silas's solitude now became a comfortable, shared language. They could spend a whole day working, he mending the fence line that bordered the property, she clearing a patch of land for a garden, and exchanged no more than a dozen words. Yet they were in constant communication. A glance to see if the other needed help, a shared cup of water under the midday sun, the simple act of sitting together on the porch at dusk, watching the colors fade from the sky. He taught her how to track, how to read the signs of the forest. She, in turn, brought a softness to the harsh edges of his existence. She planted wild herbs by the cabin door, and their scent filled the air. She found a patch of wild berries and made jam, its sweetness a taste he had not experienced in years. The cabin, once a purely functional shelter, began to feel like a home. The hard lines of the room were softened by a woven blanket she hung on the wall, its colors bright against the dark wood. Shared meals were no longer a tense necessity, but a quiet ritual that marked the end of the day. One evening, as they sat by the fire, he was cleaning his rifle, and she was mending a tear in his shirt. The domesticity of the scene was so profound, so different from the life he had known, that he paused, watching the firelight play on her face as she concentrated on her stitches. He saw the strength there, the pride, the deep, quiet resilience that had drawn him in from the very beginning. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and her hands stilled. Her eyes met his across the small space. In her gaze, he saw not the fear of a victim or the wariness of a survivor, but the clear, steady light of an equal, a partner. He had pulled a stranger from the snow to save her life. He had fought beside a soldier to defend their home. And now he was sitting beside a woman who had, piece by quiet piece, rebuilt his world. The lines around his eyes, carved by wind and loss, seemed to soften. For the first time in a lifetime, they held not the memory of what was lost, but the quiet, hopeful promise of what had been found.